Tyler, go through a counter.
Thank you, man. Yeah, they do. I'm at
Harold's dispatching now anyhow. Harold? Yeah. This thing was built in 1923 and it operated in Chicago until 1953. Fortunately for us, it wasn't scrapped when it was taken out of service. Instead, the Chicago Transit Authority used the car as a storehouse for many years at a bus garage, so it was preserved in kind of disreputable shape. We were able to restore it, and we hope you're enjoying your ride on it. How many of you remember riding cars like this in Chicago? Anybody? Not you, you're too young. Okay, that's not surprising. They've been gone since 1958. Streetcars used to be very common in Chicago and in other cities. What they were vehicles like this. They operated on railroad tracks right in the city street. They were embedded in the city street, and usually one track for the cars to go in each direction, so there are two tracks in the street. And what they did is they picked up and dropped off people just like buses do today. The only difference was they couldn't leave their tracks to pull over to the curb, so people had to come out to the middle of the street to board the cars. Now when you take a look at, I'm sure you've all seen pictures or photographs of streetcars in Chicago at various points in time, and you probably look at them and think, gee, they're kind of a cute, arcane form of transit. Must have been kind of fun to ride, like an amusement park ride. But they probably weren't very practical. See, he thinks that. Actually, I'm scaring her. Okay. But I have that same effect on my wife. If you think that, you couldn't be more wrong. Streetcars were an absolute, very important form of transport in their day. They're absolutely vital to most cities. As a matter of fact, the streetcar is very responsible for shaping the modern city, both in this country and in other countries, and modern industry. And to understand why, you kind of got to think of what it was like to get around the big city before there were streetcars. 1850 in Chicago. You're an average person. How do you get around? You walk. You walk. Only the rich could afford horses and buggies. Everybody else walked. And that's the way cities have been since antiquity. The streetcar was the first time that average people could ride around a city. Everybody could ride around the city. And that means people could live miles away from where they were working and shopping. Well, that's really important. Because that made possible big retail commercial areas like the Chicago Loop. It made possible large industrial complexes that require hundreds or thousands of workers from all over the city. It couldn't have happened without the streetcar because the people couldn't get there without the streetcar. So this was a very important form of transport. And these systems were huge. It wasn't just a few lines. They blanketed a city. The Chicago system, for example, had about 1,000 miles of track embedded in the streets. That's like from Chicago to New York. They had thousands of cars. They hauled hundreds of thousands of people a day, and that's the way the city moved for many, many years. And it's not only Chicago, it's cities all over the country. Well, if streetcars were that important, what happened to them? Why don't you see them anymore? Buses and cars. And the cars came first. By the 1920s, automobiles had become very popular, become very common, and become very affordable for most people. Henry Ford was selling cars as fast as he could produce them. Well, those cars were taking a lot of business from the streetcars, so the streetcar companies were looking for ways to cut their costs. At the same time, the automobile did something else. It caused cities to pave their streets. That sounds kind of funny, doesn't it? Before the automobile, most city streets weren't paved, even the main streets. Only in the downtown areas would you see paved streets. With paved streets, you didn't need railroad tracks anymore to support a vehicle this big. If you could develop a vehicle to drive on these new paved streets, you could get rid of the tracks. In other words, if you could develop a bus. By the 1930s, they had developed buses that were big enough to do the job of streetcars in small and medium-sized cities. And it's not much of a coincidence that in the 1930s you start seeing the small and medium-sized cities converting their streetcar systems to buses. By the end of World War II, buses had become big enough they could do the job of streetcars even in big cities, and the big cities started to convert. That's what happened in Chicago. The Chicago system was pretty much intact at the end of World War II. The Chicago Transit Authority took it over in 1947, and by 1958 they had converted the whole system to buses. The same thing was happening all over the country. You will still see in some cities in this country a few cities where they have a few streetcar lines, maybe a historic line or two like in San Francisco or New Orleans, maybe a few lines that operate in the streets in the outlying areas but then come into a downtown subway like in Philadelphia and Boston. But these big systems that blanketed a city are all gone, and they're probably not coming back. Now, as long as we're talking about the Chicago area, you all know, of course, that the Chicago Loop was named after the elevator that goes around it, right? Right? You all know that, right? It's wrong. It's not what it's named after. Anybody know what it's really named after? Cable cars. Everybody thinks of cable cars as unique to San Francisco, but in the last part of the 19th century, many cities had cable cars, including Chicago. Chicago had a bigger system than San Francisco. And the principal Chicago lines looped downtown in a series of 3 big terminal loops. So the people started to refer to the downtown area as the Loop District. It was called that before the L was built. So the next time you have a Trivial Pursuit party, make sure to try that one on your friends and watch them all roll their eyes in absolute boredom. Do you have any questions? Nope? Okay, we'll be on our way. Okay, you guys all ready? Did everybody get a chance to ring the bell? Who didn't? You didn't? Come over here. It's that button on the floor. I need you to bang on it like this. Hard. Twice. One more time. Okay. Anybody else? You haven't done it yet? Bang on that twice. There you go. You want to do it? Bang on that twice. Okay? You want to do it? is next. Most of the nice equipment is inside the buildings, not outside. So if you haven't been to the buildings, by all means do so. All right, the 10-foot roll flies here. Very good. Stop. You'll see 3 diesels right ahead of us. Those aren't ours. They're Union Pacific engines. They're active locomotives. They're just visiting out here for the weekend. Take a look at them because you probably won't get a chance to see them out here again. The locomotive nearest us is the oldest one. It's a old yard. It's a yard locomotive. That's why it says UPY something on it. That's the way they designate their yard engine. The next locomotive that's designed for the Northwestern Railroad is one of the last locomotives the Northwestern acquired before their emergence in the Union Pacific, and it's one of the last locomotives that's still on the UP that's still in the original Northwestern colors. The locomotive ahead of it, which also says Northwestern, is hold on a second. IRM dispatcher, IRM 3142 IRM dispatcher. We got people in that Northwestern Heritage, and they're right next to the trolley wire. They need to be gotten off there immediately. Yeah, get them really close. All right, I'm sending somebody from the car. Well, those people, there's a trolley wire up there.
There's a trolley wire above. Yeah. And they're climbing up in that.
At any rate, that locomotive is a modern locomotive. It's only a couple of years old. The reason it's painted up with a Northwestern locomotive is the Union Pacific has a heritage fleet. And they have some of their newer locomotives painted up to commemorate their principal predecessors. And that's the one that's painted up for the Northwestern. You'll notice the number on it is 1995. That's not a coincidence. That's the year of the merger. Okay, next street at the station will be Depot Street.
Christians.